It looks like a small group of counter demonstrators has surrounded the Robert E. Lee Memorial. They are completely surrounded and outnumbered.
Cheers broke out Saturday after a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee was lifted from its base and removed entirely in Charlottesville, Virginia. This comes nearly 4 years after white supremacist protests over plans to remove it led to clashes in which a woman was killed after she was run down by a car driven by a self-described neo-Nazi.
After years of debate and protests, today final approval is granted to remove the bust of a Confederate general and KKK Grand Wizard from the Tennessee State Capitol.
Yep, after a marathon discussion today, the Tennessee Historical Commission voting 25-1 to approve a petition waiver from the Capitol Commission. That means Governor Bill Lee now has permission to remove the bust here from inside the Capitol, something he's vocally
supported.
4
Confederate monuments were taken down overnight in Baltimore. Activists put up a new sculpture where Generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson stood until their removal.
Down, baby!
Dozens of people gathered at Hemming Park to speak out and urge lawmakers to take down Confederate statues in and around Jacksonville. Some want the monuments removed, while others say the monuments should stay. There has been an ongoing debate about Confederate monuments being removed because the Confederacy lost the Civil War, and those monuments are seen as racist reminders of slavery. However, some people disagree and say the monuments are about heritage.
We're out here to defend our Southern heritage and our ancestors.
It's not about metal, it's not about brass, it's not about marble. It's really about what these monuments represent. And they represent racial hatred. They represent racism. They represent white supremacy. They represent black oppression. And that's why they must be removed.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, but today we are joined by a phenomenal guest. Many of you who study the Civil War Confederate monuments are going to know who she is. She is a pioneer, and honestly, it is truly an honor to have her on this channel to walk us through not just a more modern history, but some of the most controversial aspects to not just modern history in general, but to the very heart of American history, a history that's very personal to me and most of my subscribers who will be watching this history right now. And so, without further ado, Dr. Cox, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me, Nick. Looking forward to the conversation.
And for our subscribers who may not be familiar with your work based on the areas that they usually focus on, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
I am a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I am a Southern historian. I write about Southern history and culture. I'm the author of 4 books. The most recent one that we'll probably get into today is No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. My other books include a book called Dixie's Daughters about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, one called Dreaming of Dixie about how the South was created in popular culture. And then right when the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally happened, about a month after that, I had a book come out that seems to have gotten forgotten called Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, and the Gothic South, which is really the book I'm probably most proud of. So anyway, I'm founded the public history program at UNC Charlotte, and I'm back directing it for a couple of years. And I'm a OAH distinguished lecturer. I've written op-eds for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, CNN, and been interviewed about this subject of Confederate monuments by journalists from around the world.
And to my subscribers, before we jump into this, I want to encourage you, check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to all of the awesome work Dr. Cox is doing. And honestly, it's truly not only phenomenal, but absolutely necessary when it comes to combating modern issues, but also, in many cases, a historiography that's not always truthful. And so, check out the links, give her your full support, because people like her are the reason why me and you even have the understanding of the past that we have today. And honestly, you're not going to find a better mind when it comes to the areas of subjects we're going to be discussing today. And so, without further ado, we're going to jump in. And so, I want to ask you, based on your research, your expertise, and even your imagination, when you see it pop up in the news, or you even hear someone talk about it, or as you ponder it while you're doing your own research and writing, when you think of Confederate monuments, what comes to your mind?
Because it comes up quite a bit in the news, I think, oh, this is going to be the never-ending story, right? And I feel like I'm going to continue to be drawn back into it repeatedly. Some of those stories, I feel frustrated for the person who's involved. For example, a councilwoman, Tammy Sawyer, who's in Memphis, Tennessee, and speaking out on the topic of removing the remains of Nathan Bedford Forrest and his wife, there had the monument has already been removed, but just to have people harassing her and giving her death threats. Same for another woman down in Florence, Alabama, Camille Bennett. Very recently had the Ku Klux Klan show up at one of her rallies. And so when these things come up, I feel, first of all, I'm glad I wrote the book. And second, I really hope that it can be helpful to people like that who are on the front lines of this controversy and this effort at removal.
Many people say that when you remove these monuments or even contextualize them, that you're erasing history. And so I have to ask, is that really the case?
Absolutely not. I mean, the short answer. The longer answer is that monuments never taught a history lesson, not by themselves, right? People have used them to try to teach history, but it's usually a particular narrative that may or may not be true. We have to think, first of all, of monuments as that they are memorials. They're meant to memorialize. They're about memory, not really about history. And so as a historian who's researched these things, I can say, well, there are always going to be photographs, there's postcards, there are speeches that were given during the unveiling. There are all kinds of materials that I, as a historian, could go and find and discover about the history of the monuments, even if they didn't exist anymore. And this is just true of a lot of history, honestly. If something that is, there's a lot of history that doesn't stand anymore. And so it's up to, that's why there are libraries and there's archives, and there are authors like myself, people who write books about these things. And so the history is not being erased. It won't be erased. It won't ever be lost or forgotten. And I think people need to understand that. When we look at these particular monuments, most of them were put up 30, 40, 50 years after the Civil War. So they aren't really Civil War monuments as much as they are a reflection of the Jim Crow generation that placed them there. Because the early monuments, you could obviously say, yes, these were about the Confederacy and Confederate soldiers and honoring them because they were in the cemeteries where the dead were buried. But many years later, there's a sort of new interpretations being added into what these monuments are about. And when you look at the work of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, we know that they weren't just looking backward in time about their ancestors. They were really looking. They had a very future-focused agenda with children, and so they were hoping that not only in the books, the pro-Southern books or pro-Confederate books that they put in the library, or the education that they try to give children through the Children of the Confederacy, for example, or the textbooks that the children were using. The UDC is thinking about this and saying we want to shape a future South, a new South that's really based on Confederate values, and those values were Yes, they were about states' rights, but they're also in the context of the 20th century really about white supremacy. You can't have slavery anymore, but you can still have white supremacy. And so you have to look at monuments as more, and I would say this about monuments, no matter what kind they are, they're really about they really say more about the people who place them there, not about who they say this is about. It's really about the people who place them there and what they hope future generations will get out of it. If you ever hear people talk about monuments when they want to put a monument in place, if we could take, for example, the World War II memorial on the Washington Mall. The rhetoric that was around that is the same kind of rhetoric that United Daughters of Confederacy used, which is, we want to put something there for future generations to look at and to think about, etc. So it really, you have to think about monuments really not about history in so many ways. It's about memory and memorialization. It's about the generation that put that they're feeling a little bit better about themselves that they got this project done. And so I'm not worried about the history of these Confederate monuments or of the Civil War itself.
That's a really good point, because if you look at these statues, and it's like you said, it's about who put them there. And when you look at these statues, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's the propaganda that follows the events that they're depicting, if that makes sense. And that's a brilliant point.
They get reinterpreted by different generations. One of the things that happened in the 1950s, for example, is that as civil rights movement was really starting to gather some steam, the Confederate Memorial Days, which had in some places had not been commemorated in years, but they kind of get revived. And there's an example in my book that I talk about, which is this a state representative goes to Vicksburg, Mississippi for the Confederate Memorial Day celebration, and he gives a speech, but the speech is about federal intrusion on states' rights around the issue of really around civil rights without him saying that. And also he talks about communism. Like, that's not what Confederate Memorial Day was about, right? And that's part of his speech. So he's reinterpreting these statues for a modern day audience. And you could fast forward to Charlottesville, when these men who showed up there said, they were there under the pretense of defending the removal of the Robert E. Lee monument. Many of them, first of all, were not even Southerners, but they go there for a reason. They use that as a call to arms for white nationalism. And I say, even white supremacists know that this represents white power, white supremacy to them. So they know that, and they're using it in a very modern context. So these things get reinterpreted generation after generation.
I want to talk about that interpretation. On one hand, we have historians who have a much deeper insight into these monuments, the how, the why, so on and so forth. On the other side, you have groups that want to use and rally around those monuments for, let's be honest, racist and oftentimes violent reasons. And then you have a third group, in my opinion, that's stuck in the middle. And I feel like these are honestly well-intentioned and innocent, let's say, history buffs, novices like me, who may not understand the battle that's going on here. Is there anything that you would like to personally say to them that would help them understand what's going on?
Well, of course, I'd have them read my book, but I think I think, and this is part of the reason I wrote the book, is for people who are sort of not on in these extremes, but in the middle somewhere, who want to understand the issue. Why are people fighting about it? Why are they arguing about these things? And also to understand, and I think this is a real critical point, and that I I mentioned in the book is that protests against Confederate monuments didn't begin when Black Lives Matter started. It goes all the way back to the 19th century. And there's a longer history of that protest or critique of what Confederate monuments stand for, coming from primarily from the Black community in the South. And so it isn't a Black Lives Matter thing that just happened overnight. This has been ongoing. What's happened in recent years are a couple things. One is that more people have joined with Black Southerners in protesting these monuments. So a cross section of the South. And the second thing is that after the Charleston massacre in 2015, the Dylan Roof murdered 9 parishioners in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. What had been just regional debates about Confederate monuments became national debates or national discussions. And so that's why we're sort of in this moment right now, is because it moved beyond just, people in a community arguing back and forth, although that's still the case. It became a national monument, and then politicians at the state level and at the national level use this issue to drive a wedge between people, and they really misunderstand the issue, honestly. But it works for them politically.
And so now we come to a question that I think is fundamental for this episode, and that is what to do with them. We look at Confederate monuments where they are today, the ones that are still standing. And I have to ask, in your opinion, in your mind, how should we as the American people and the general public deal with these monuments?
That's a great question. It's a complicated answer, and the reason is that first, let's say, just understand that the vast majority of these monuments are local objects. They were placed there by the local community, or primarily the UDC chapter in that community. It may have even included some funds from the county government. Tax money actually may have gone into that. And so they're in the public square of a particular town. So logically, one would think then it's the local community that will make the decision today. And that's the way it began originally, those discussions began. But what has happened, and a lot of it's happened since 2015, is that states across the South have passed what they call monument preservation laws or heritage protection acts. And what those laws have done is prohibit local control, as they've taken away local control. So a local government in a state cannot remove a monument, even if that's the will of the community. And so some of these things vary by state. So someone would say, well, how did it happen in Virginia? Part of the reason it happened is there was a changing of the guard in the state legislature, and the law was changed that restored local control. And so when that happened, you saw some monuments come down in Richmond and across the state of Virginia. In North Carolina, where I live, there was a loophole in our law. It says if this becomes a public safety issue, and you have to understand that it has become a public safety issue in some places, where you have the Proud Boys showing up on the one hand and the people on the other that want to see these monuments removed. So in that case, and at the state capitol, monuments were removed under that loophole, and in a number of communities that has happened. Not a lot, but more. It's significantly more in the last year since the George Floyd murder. But the reality is that most of these monuments are firmly in place and they're protected by these state laws. And so what happens, it's hard to know. It's like, what would they do if the local community had control? I would say the local community makes the decision, and they can do that by bringing, all the stakeholders to the table to have a conversation. And it's not just about removal in the end. It's about why were these things divisive to begin with? Can we talk about that? Can we talk about the racial divide here that these monuments that kind of engender, because that's really what it's about. It's not just, oh, somebody's ready to, wipe away someone's ancestral heritage. It's about these things are painful objects and have been painful to primarily to the Black communities across the South. And I think, these things have stood in the way of people's civil rights. If you think about monuments, most of them are on the grounds of courthouses where there are court cases held, where many, and certainly throughout most of the history of the South, the defendants would have been African American. And also there are lynchings that have taken place on the courthouse lawn. And it's also where people went to register to vote once the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. So it was, though, there's a lot wrapped up in these statues that I think if people understood that, they'd understand why people want to remove them.
As we come to the end of this episode, I have a question that I think is vital for especially the future. It's no secret that museums often battle for space. Many of them are already crowded with a variety of objects throughout the history of humanity. And so I wanted to ask, for those that do have the space, in your opinion, for those that want it, do you think that Confederate monuments have a place in museums?
Also a complicated question, right? Because first of all, museums have collections policies. They may not be able to take in a particular object. Most of them wouldn't have the space for some of these are giant objects, statues are. So they may not have the space for them on the grounds. The third thing about that is for a museum is that you've just moved it. The problem, you just kick the can down the road and they're going to have to deal with that because a lot of museums have public funding. And somebody would say, well, you don't want to publicly fund this monument on the grounds of the museum, the local museum. So what I've seen in communities, at least some that have removed them, is either a few things. One is that they've been moved to cemeteries. The UDC has taken them back. Who knows where they are? Most of them have gone into storage. They weren't destroyed. They weren't, people see one monument torn down or spray painted, but they weren't, they haven't been ground down or melted down or anything like that. A lot of them are in storage, or they're going to be placed on, battlefields, state battlefield parks or things like that, where they can get the appropriate context and the appropriate history lesson from a park ranger, for example.
And I think that's a really good point. In a way, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I feel like moving those, for example, to, let's say, battlefields. Like, let's say it is a Robert E. Lee statue and they put it at Gettysburg because he was there. I think that is an interesting thing. I like it even better if it even comes with a contextualization that talks about the reasons why it was built in the first place, why it was moved, and why it's now where it is today. I feel like it's one thing to have them at a battlefield where it's appropriate because these are military figures. These are people who, for reasons that I don't agree with or do agree with, depending on what side, fought, bled, died, or survived in a conflict that really shaped what the U.S. was going to become. And I think it's one thing for it to be on a battlefield and another thing to be where American justice is dispensed. What kind of image are you seeing if, let's say, you are a minority and you are going to a justice system, and as you walk into that building, you have to walk underneath something that, really is the very epitome of what is against you as an individual, as a person who literally fought for a world in which you would not be free. And so I completely support the movement and recontextualization of those monuments. And so to my subscribers, I want to know your thoughts. What do you think? And so don't forget to not only comment your thoughts below, but to also, once again, follow the work Dr. Cox is doing. And especially if you're new to this, to help you better understand not just history, but now. Why are these monuments controversial? Why have they always been controversial? What war is going on that not only is fighting to shape history, but historiography, the present and the future? And so when your kids see a monument like this in the future, what are you going to tell them? What are you going to explain to them? And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much and have a wonderful night. And Dr. Cox, thank you so much for coming on the show and providing the insight needed to truly understand the subject that we're discussing.
Well, thank you, Nick. Enjoyed talking with you.